If you were with us for the last few episodes, you're going to be happy to be with this episode and the next one because now we get to parts of the Bible that are a whole lot easier to read. Obviously, the previous episodes were important because those are challenging parts of the Bible to read, and because it's helpful to have those rules that guide us through them, so that we can get more out of them, and so that it actually makes them easier to read. But now we get to the New Testament, we get to the Gospels, we get to the story of Jesus, and a whole bunch of things will just get a little easier right now. But that doesn't mean that we can let down our guard and just simply say whatever we want or believe whatever we want about them. We still have to keep the proper rigor up when we're doing the reading through of the Bible, but the reading itself is going to be a much simpler process from this point on because today we get into the Gospels and Acts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts here today in our episode 7. So, the books we're going to be looking at today are what are called the New Testament narratives. If you saw our first episode on the Old Testament, we saw that the first books of the Bible are called the Old Testament narratives. That is, they tell the continuing story of the nation of Israel and their relationship with God. And today we get to the New Testament narratives. So they are like the New Testament is arranged similarly to the Old Testament in that it begins with narratives, and then it moves to, in the case of the New Testament, teaching, and in the case of the Old Testament, wisdom and poetry, and then it ends with prophecy. But it's different in that the narrative books in the New Testament are written in a different way than the Old Testament books are written. In the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers tell continuing parts of a chronological story. So the story of Genesis continues in Exodus, the story of Exodus continues in Leviticus. That's not the case with the Gospels. In the case of the Gospels, they tell the same story, but from four different viewpoints. So in the Old Testament, the narratives continue the story one upon another upon another. But in the New Testament, it's kind of like interviewing four different witnesses to the life of Jesus, and each of them giving their viewpoint on the same events. So it's not continual one upon another, but it's the same events told from four different viewpoints. Now, the viewpoints of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar, so similar that theologians call them the synoptic gospels. Synoptic from a Greek term meaning to see together, optic to see, syn, S-Y-N, from which we get the word synonymous. So seeing together. That's what they mean. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke have something like 80 to 90% of their verses similar. In fact, a whole lot of them are exactly the same quotes. But John is very different. John has about 80% different from the other gospels. So you get four very different viewpoints that way. Acts then does continue the story. It starts where where the gospels leave off, with the ascension of Jesus into heaven, and then it tells the story of the early church, particularly narrowing in the last 2/3 or so of the book to the life of the apostle Paul, who then writes a major portion of the books that follow the book of Acts. Okay. So as we get into the Gospels, there's a handful of things that we need to know up front that some people just kind of assume, but we can't assume anymore because we want to make sure that everybody's clear about the facts. First of all, Jesus did not write the Gospels. As far as we know, Jesus didn't leave any written record at all. There are certainly no written records of Jesus that survive at all. So Jesus did not write the Gospels. They are not his account of his life. It's not autobiography, it's biography. Somebody else wrote them later. Secondly, these Gospels are among the last of the New Testament books written, not among the first. Now, the first maybe half a dozen to 8 or 9 or so of the books written from the New Testament were the epistles, the letters, which we'll get to in the next episode. In fact, in the next episode, we'll begin with a chronology of when the New Testament books were written, so you get an idea of how that happened. But the Gospels came along a little bit later, and in fact, the Gospel of John was one of, if not the last Bible book written. So even though they appear first in the New Testament, they were not among the first ones that were written. The New Testament actually started with what we will see next week, the epistles or the letters. It started with the letters of advice and encouragement from James and from Paul primarily. Those were the first ones that were written. The first words of the New Testament ever written were written probably around 50 AD. So less than 20 years after Jesus was crucified. James, who probably wrote the first of those, was actually Jesus' half brother, as mentioned in the Gospels. And then Luke and Acts came along from Luke's firsthand travel and research notes. So there was a doctor, actually. His name was Luke. And as Paul was traveling, as laid out in the book of Acts, Luke would travel with him on occasion. You can spot those spots. This is one of the real cool things if you look for it. Next time you read through the book of Acts, at the beginning of it, it's going to be talking in third person. They did this, they did that, they did this. And then partway through Paul's story, every once in a while it says, then we went here, we went there, we went there. Then it goes back to they did, then it comes back to we did, we did. And if you'll take note to that when you're reading through the book of Acts, what you discover is this: the spots where it says we, that's when the author, Luke, was actually with Paul and his group. And so he's telling it as a firsthand account of what we did. And when he says they, that's when he wasn't with the group for periods of time, and he tells what they did by getting reports from them. It's one of those things where if you don't know to look for it, you don't see it. But once you know to look for it, it's one of those cool little aha moments the next time you read the book of Acts. So Jesus didn't write any of them, but the Gospels came along after these were written. But even one of the Gospels, or even one of the Gospels and the book of Acts, were written in tandem together. And then the letters that we'll talk about next week all happened during the times that are described in the book of Acts, similar to the way the books of wisdom and prophecy and poetry in the Old Testament were written during the times of the Old Testament narratives. So that gives us an idea of kind of the order of the books in the New Testament. But getting back now to the Gospels and the book of Acts, which is our concentration for this episode, the Gospels were written by Jesus' disciples, specifically Matthew and John. Yes, those are the Matthew and John of the 12 disciples, and by people who researched and interviewed the disciples, namely Mark and Luke. Mark was actually Peter's secretary. So it's one of those kind of mysteries of the Bible, why the book of Mark is called Mark, because it's actually Peter's testimony of Jesus, but written down by Mark. So why it carries the name of the person who really acted as the secretary for it rather than as the person who dictated it. One of those interesting, strange little, quirks of scripture. So Matthew and John were written by those disciples. Mark is Peter's gospel, but bears the name of Mark, who's the secretary who wrote it down. And Luke was not one of the 12. He came along later, as we mentioned already. He spent a lot of time with Paul and his traveling companions. But Luke, we know Luke wrote Luke and Acts, and we know that he was a traveling companion because at the beginning of both Luke and Acts, take a look at it, he actually says, I am writing this because I researched this, because I did interviews with the people who experienced these things. And in fact, many of the people I interviewed are still alive, and you can check with them, which of course applied back then when he wrote it, not today, 2,000 years later. None of them are alive except for Jesus, of course. But that's where we get them. So two of them firsthand, Matthew and John. Mark pretty much firsthand by Peter's secretary, and Luke is the scientist, the doctor, doing research, doing interviews, and putting all of that together. So it's helpful to have those different viewpoints. Each book also has a different purpose. So let me walk you through those purposes of each of the Gospels, because, well, if they tell the same story, why do we need four of them? Well, because they have different backgrounds. First of all, they come from different people who have different perspectives. Secondly, they have a different purpose. And let's go through them. Matthew was written by the disciple, Matthew, as we mentioned already. It was written to Jewish people to show Jesus as Messiah. This is why Matthew, for instance, begins with the genealogy of Jesus to trace him back as the Jewish Messiah. Matthew is one of only two Gospels that includes the birth of Jesus, but he includes the visit of the wise men and not of the shepherds, and of the star, because that points to the Messiahship of Jesus. You'll notice when you read through the book of Matthew, there are tons of references to this fulfilled the prophecy in the Old Testament. This is written to Jews, and so the things that matter to the Jews are emphasized in the book of Matthew. Matthew includes, for instance, the Sermon on the Mount, which is a compilation of Jesus' teachings from throughout his teaching life, but it shows it builds the case for the new covenant that replaces the old covenant. This is where you see Jesus saying, I have said to you, or you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, where he actually helps us understand how the old covenant leads into the new covenant. This was especially important for the Jewish people. So when you read through the book of Matthew, look for those Jewish references. That's who it's written to. Secondly, Mark, as I said, was written by Peter's scribe, Mark, and it was written to Roman converts. And it was written to show Jesus as conqueror. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It is very action-packed. The most repeated word in it is immediately. It's about Jesus did this, then immediately he went and did this, then immediately he went and did this. Why? Because Peter was a man of action, because the Romans were men of action, and he wanted to show Jesus as an active person who did things that were important. Thirdly, you've got the book of Luke, written by Luke, who was a physician. As I mentioned earlier, he was a traveling companion of Paul. Luke wrote this primarily to Greeks, to learned people. He was a smart man himself. He was learned. He was well schooled. He had a scientific background, and so he wanted to show to people who are also smart, who the Greeks were very smart and philosophers. He wanted to show that Jesus' teaching could stand up with their teaching, and in fact was better than their teaching. That Jesus wasn't just some random person who taught random people, but that in fact it had a strong philosophical underpinning that could stand next to anything else. And as a doctor, he showed a lot of the miracles, especially the miracles of Jesus as the healer. He loved to show those parts of the story. John was written by Jesus' disciple John, and this was written to everybody. He just wants everybody to know about Jesus, and it's written to show Jesus as God's beloved Son. So it begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. He was in the beginning with God. He was the one who created. Then almost half of the book, the last 10 of 21 chapters, is about Jesus last week. He spends a lot of time on on what's leading up to the crucifixion itself. Why? Because he was the only disciple who was there through all of it. So we get four very different perspectives for four very different reasons for four very different audiences. And when you understand these differences, then the next time you read them, you can spot those differences and appreciate that. Sometimes today we just simply blend all the stories together, and most of us can't tell which of the Gospels a particular story occurred in. Some of them appear in all four, very few do. A lot of them appear in three. But when you see why each of them picked the parts they do and who they were speaking to, you go, oh, that now makes sense. And you can actually get a greater appreciation for them as you read them. Also, in the book of John, the most repeated word there is love. That's where we get, for instance, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. A lot of references to Jesus as a man of love from the book of John. The book of Acts, then, as we get to it, sets up some of the principles for the early church. But we have to be careful when we read them that we take them in their context. It's tempting as the church to go to the book of Acts and read it as an instruction manual for the church. The book of Acts was not written as an instruction manual for the church. It was written as a history of the early church. Now, because of that, it shows a lot of the things that the early church did, how they behaved, and it gives us some examples of how to set things up for today. So yes, they can be examples for us. They set precedent for us, but it's not written as an instruction manual. So we can't read it as an instruction manual. It's like, it's more like if we read a biography of someone who is important in our past, and we can read about them and we can say, oh, I see how they thought about this and how they thought about that. And what you want to do is you want to follow their way of thinking, but you don't necessarily have to duplicate exactly the things that they did because they lived in a different time. Here's an example. It says early in the book of Acts that the early disciples sold all that they had and had all things in common. Now, there are people who look at that and go, well, then all Christians are supposed to sell everything they have and have all things in common. But it's not an instruction manual for us. It's not telling us we have to do that. It's telling us they did that. But if you read it in context, you discover they did that because they were undergoing severe persecution. The moment you became a Christian, and you were denied either your paganism or your Judaism, often you would be left without a family to support you and without any help. So the Christians pooled all their resources to help each other. And then it says, because of that, there were no poor among them. But it does not then say, go and do likewise. It doesn't say you, followers of Jesus, from now on must pool all your resources. That's not what it says. Generosity, yes. But following that exact template, no. That's what they did because of specific reasons, but it's not written as a template for us that we are required to follow. Their behavior should be seen as an example and not as a command. And the example for that area is, of course, when we don't have much, that's when we need to be generous so that we can all pool our resources and all share it together. That's what they're there for. Stories are told as stories and not as commandments. We need to remember that whenever we read the scripture. Commandments are commands. Stories are examples. Since it's not on the screen, let me say that for you again. It's important. Commandments are commands. Stories are examples. Stories don't give us promises, they teach us principles, as we saw a couple episodes ago. And stories are not commands, but they are good examples for us. So we can learn from them, we can follow them, but it's not the same as a thou shalt or a thou shalt not. It just simply doesn't apply in our lives in the same way. It still applies in our lives, it still matters, but it doesn't apply in the same way as a commandment does. So don't read them as commands. And then finally, for this particular episode today, when reading these books, I thought I had that in there, but I don't. I'll just say it to you. Okay. When reading these books, we need to think in episodes. Think in episodes. Because what our Bibles today have chapter and verse divisions, which we're happy for, but I explained to you a few episodes ago that those are only about 500 years old. The thought process of the Bible does not come to us according to the chapter and verse divisions. In some places, we want to read it by sentences. As we said earlier, there are some spots where we want to read it by chapters. In fact, that's what we'll see next week in our talk about the letters. You need to read those in chapters. But not chapters, paragraphs. Sorry, we want to read the letters and the epistles by paragraphs. But when you read the Gospels, you want to read them in episodes and think in episodes. So instead of taking out an individual verse or an individual sentence, those can speak to us, but we always need to be sure that they're in context. The biggest context, of course, is the book that they're in. The next context is the episode. So, for instance, you don't divide it, don't just memorize a verse or look at how a chapter unfolds. You want to take a look at the entire conversation Jesus had with the woman at the well, or the entire episode of the healing of the man born blind. And it doesn't matter if it's not a full chapter or if it folds from one chapter into another chapter, because the chapter divisions are not original. You want to look at the episode. Jesus interaction with the disciples at the lakeside where they hauled in a whole bunch of extra fish. Take that episode as a piece, and then see how it proceeds to the next episode as the next piece, and then link the episodes together. So we're not taking them individually, but we want to think in episodes. We want to see how the episodes tie together. So it's not about tying chapters together or verses together or even sentences and paragraphs together. It's about tying the episodes together. When we do that, we get a better picture of what's happening and how Jesus' life unfolded and what we can learn from it. Okay, that's it for today. Next time, we're going to take a look at the letters, Romans through Jude. And in that, when we get there, as we will see, we'll be thinking in chapters. And this is where we get our theology and the way we think and behave as Christians. So this week and next week are real central to us as Christians, especially. I hope you got something out of that. I hope we come back next week. We'll see you then. Thanks.